Before TikTok, before television, before even the printing press, how did a rumour topple kings? How could a heretical idea travel thousands of miles without a single book? What if I told you that medieval Europe had its own version of the internet? Not wires and Wi-Fi, but whispers and parchment, inns and iconography, relics and roads. This is the story of the hidden web that connected a fragmented world long before Gutenberg inked his first page. We imagine the Middle Ages as isolated, slow and illiterate. But dig deeper and you'll find a labyrinth of communication channels more complex than we ever imagined. From the dusty trade routes of the Silk Road to the sacred corridors of monasteries, ideas zipped along at lightning speed. Relatively speaking, merchants, monks, musicians and midwives became the routers of their day, carrying messages encoded in song, story and stone. This was a time when information was power, but also a deadly risk. A poorly timed phrase could earn you a charge of heresy. A copied manuscript could change a kingdom. Yet somehow, knowledge flowed. Across battle lines, across class divides, across time. This wasn't accidental. The medieval world had its own infrastructure, a decentralized network of oral traditions, visual symbolism, encoded language and spiritual authority. News moved along pilgrimage routes, through letters smuggled in bales of cloth, across university lecture halls and merchant guilds. Think of it as the analog web, a living, breathing system of shared ideas, updated not by coding languages, but by memory, rumour, and trust. In this documentary, we'll unravel the secrets of this forgotten information age. We'll explore how ideas travelled without books, how images replaced language, and how a rumour could spread across Europe faster than you think, all in a time when 90% of the population couldn't even read. Was there censorship? Absolutely. But there was also subversion. Was there propaganda? Constantly. But there were also rebellions born from radical texts copied by candlelight. This is not just a tale of monks and ink. It's the story of how humans, driven by an unstoppable urge to connect, built an invisible web across kingdoms, continents, and centuries. So open your mind and prepare to plug into the medieval internet. In a world without electricity or email, the heartbeat of medieval information didn't echo in palaces or marketplaces. It pulsed behind stone walls, cloistered in silence. The monastery was more than just a place of prayer. It was the server farm of its time. Inside its thick candlelit walls, monks laboured day and night, copying ancient texts, preserving the knowledge of empires long gone, and sometimes slipping in their own commentary between the lines. The scriptorium, the copying room, was a hive of mental labour. Ink-stained fingers trembled with both devotion and exhaustion. A single manuscript could take years to complete. But these monks weren't just preserving theology. They meticulously reproduced Greek philosophy, Roman legal codes, medicinal treatises, astronomical charts, and the strange, often forbidden texts from foreign lands. Some even translated Islamic scientific works from Arabic into Latin, unknowingly carrying the seeds of the Renaissance centuries early. But here's what's fascinating. Every copied book was a unique file with minor variations, monastic metadata added in the margins. A silent commentary, a correction, sometimes even a coded opinion. These marginalia functioned like comment threads, invisible to outsiders but whispering through generations. Beyond the books, monks communicated through a network of monasteries spread across Europe. The Benedictines, the Cistercians, the Cluniacs. They were like sub-networks in a vast, slow-moving cloud. When a monastery fell, its texts and ideas often survived, carried in saddlebags or memorized by heart. Cloisters weren't just copying centers, they were also hubs of encryption. Not all knowledge was welcome in the eyes of the church. Certain writings had to be hidden. Controversial texts were sometimes buried inside more harmless volumes, their existence masked unless you knew the secret code, just like a hidden file buried inside a folder. Monks created complex calendars, astronomical charts and hidden indexes, tools to catalogue the growing corpus of human thought. They also maintained catalogues of errors, records of banned books and heretical claims. Ironically, in trying to suppress information, they often preserved it. But their most overlooked innovation was the traveling monk. Pilgrims in disguise, scholars with sacred relics, wandering preachers, they carried more than scripture. They were nodes in the medieval net, ferrying knowledge across abbeys, borders, and sometimes, under heavy guard, into the homes of nobles who were building their own private libraries. What's even more astonishing is that this knowledge traffic was, at times, subversive. A monk in Ireland could insert a line from a pagan epic. A Catalan scribe might hide a comment mocking the king. In a world where saying the wrong thing meant torture or exile, these quiet acts of intellectual rebellion were breathtakingly brave. So when we imagine the medieval monk as a silent servant, think again. He was also an archivist, an editor, an encryptor, and occasionally a hacker in a hooded robe. The monastery was the data vault of Europe, and in its silence, the seeds of revolutions were being quietly down. Imagine a crowded medieval market, livestock bleating, vendors shouting, children dodging between carts. Now imagine this chaos as something more, a web of human routers. The medieval marketplace wasn't just a centre of commerce, it was a living server of stories, songs and secrets. Before ink hit parchment or printing presses hummed, it was the human voice that carried the weight of the world's knowledge. Enter the minstrels, troubadours and jongleurs, wandering performers who doubled as memory banks. With no formal archives, societies relied on these oral messengers to preserve and transmit everything from heroic epics and biblical tales to court gossip and political commentary. Every town square was a stage, every inn a theatre, and through rhythmic poems, coded lyrics and allegorical tales, they passed along what could not be written, especially when the truth was dangerous. Their songs were layered with meaning. A tune about a brave knight might mask criticism of a corrupt noble. A humorous tale about a talking animal could veil a philosophical argument. In a world where public dissent could lead to the gallows, metaphor was survival, and the market was the grand switchboard. Merchants came from across continents, Venice, Damascus, Cairo, Bruges, bringing with them not just goods but news, customs and foreign ideas. One whispered story could travel from a Persian caravan to a French village in weeks. Traders weren't just economic agents, they were idea smugglers. Information moved through barter as well. A merchant might offer a story in exchange for shelter. A gossip might trade a scandalous rumour for extra cheese. These exchanges were ephemeral yet persistent, spreading like wildfire, reshaping local beliefs and sometimes igniting revolutions. Even body language and symbolism played roles. A red thread on a tunic, a carved staff or a unique gesture. These could signify allegiance to secret societies, underground movements, or banned ideologies. Like encrypted icons, they were silently read by those who knew the code. Sometimes this verbal network challenged power directly. Peasant uprisings were often sparked not by proclamations, but by minstrels' ballads. One famous example, the story of Robin Hood. Before it was ever written down, it existed in the voices of bards who shaped him into a folk hero and a political threat. The medieval viral content wasn't a cat video, it was a heretical joke, a banned love story, a foreign proverb that undermined the divine right of kings. And once it was spoken, it could never be erased. Even execution couldn't kill a story that had already been sung in a dozen towns. So while monasteries archived with ink, markets archived with memory, the spoken word was volatile, alive, and constantly reshaped with every retelling. It was humanity's first social media, fast, irreverent, and impossible to control. In this network of performers, traders, and talkers, we glimpse a world where information has to be seductive to survive. Only what moved the heart or threatened the powerful was carried forward. And this fragile, vibrant system of oral transmission ensured that even in the darkest corners of the medieval world, the light of knowledge flickered on. Beneath the surface of medieval Europe's rigid orthodoxy, something extraordinary was unfolding. Hidden vaults of forbidden ideas, kept alive by candlelight. These weren't dusty storerooms in monasteries. They were secret libraries. covert collections, mental arsenals quietly defying the iron grip of the church and crown. Because when knowledge became dangerous, its protectors had to go underground. Imagine a noble's estate with a false wall. Behind it, scrolls in Arabic on astronomy, treatises from ancient Greece, or even lost works from the Roman Empire, texts labelled heretical, blasphemous, or simply too radical. Yet someone risked everything to preserve them. Why? Because knowledge was power, and in the Middle Ages, power was not for the many. Some of these secret libraries were real. The famed Library of Toledo, under Muslim rule, was one such intellectual melting pot, where Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scholars translated ancient works into Latin, quietly resurrecting Plato and Aristotle from oblivion. When Christian forces reconquered the region, many feared these texts would be burned. Instead, a few scholars spirited them away into private collections across Europe. Elsewhere, Cathar communities, persecuted as heretics, hid their Gnostic Gospels in caves or built trap compartments within monasteries. These documents challenged mainstream dogma, suggesting reincarnation, questioning priestly authority, and undermining the Church's monopoly on salvation. For centuries, many believed these texts were gone forever, until discoveries like the Nag Hammadi codices or the Dead Sea Scrolls proved otherwise. But it wasn't just the elite who guarded dangerous knowledge. Hedge schools in Ireland, illegal under English rule, operated in fields, barns, and backrooms, teaching banned history, mathematics, and even ancient poetry. In many ways, these were proto-libraries, movable minds with pages tucked in satchels and lessons whispered at risk of arrest. Books themselves often disguised their purpose. Illuminated manuscripts might appear as psalters or prayer books, but contain political satire, alchemical diagrams, or pagan rituals between the lines. Some scribes used ciphered writing, subtle alterations to Latin, mirrored letters, or runic scripts, to conceal meaning from uninitiated eyes. Reading became an act of rebellion. And then there were the codices that shouldn't exist. Like the Voynich manuscript, a baffling volume written in an unknown script, filled with plants that don't exist, and women bathing in strange tubes. No one knows who wrote it, or why. Some say it's gibberish. Others believe it's an encrypted scientific text, or a magical guide hidden in plain sight. Even monasteries, ironically, played their part. Not all monks towed the line. Some, in the isolation of scriptoriums, copied texts they weren't supposed to. Greek epics, Babylonian star charts, banned philosophical essays, quietly archiving ideas the church tried to bury. These monks didn't see themselves as traitors. They saw themselves as guardians of a larger truth. This hidden architecture of knowledge ensured that when Gutenberg's press finally began rolling, the ideas it unleashed weren't new. They were old ghosts breaking free, preserved by generations who dared to remember, who dared to hide, who dared to read when the price was death. In a world where most couldn't read and only the clergy controlled written language, rulers had to find another way to speak to the masses. Enter the language of symbols, a medieval media network of iconography, regalia, coinage, and pageantry that spoke louder than any scroll. This was the power of the unwritten word, and it shaped entire kingdoms. Picture a silver coin minted by a new king. On one side, his crowned portrait, stern and divine. On the other, a lion, a sword, a cross, or a pair of scales. To us, it's just art. But to a peasant touching that coin, it was the king's voice, a declaration. I rule here. I bring justice. I defend the faith. Coins were propaganda in your pocket. You didn't need to read Latin to understand who was in charge. The same held true in architecture. Gothic cathedrals weren't just places of worship. They were storybooks carved in stone. Spires pointed to heaven, buttresses showed divine strength, and stained glass told biblical stories in colour. Hidden among these grand designs were subtle messages, monstrous gargoyles representing the dangers of heresy, or cryptic alchemical symbols tucked into chapels. Even the shape of a building, cross-shaped floor plans, conveyed religious and royal ideology. Royalty crafted an image as identity. Take Charlemagne. His throne was made from ancient marble, stolen from Rome. Not for comfort, but for a message. I am the heir of Caesar. His crown, embedded with relics. His seal, covered in Latin slogans even though the public couldn't read them. The point wasn't clarity, it was mystique. These were psychological tools meant to command awe, and it wasn't just kings. The Knights Templar used geometric shapes, red crosses, and simple uniforms to create an iconography that would endure for centuries. Their stark visual branding made them feared, revered, and unforgettable, even more than any written decree. Even rebels understood this game. In peasant revolts or during moments of religious dissent, flags with broken crosses, inverted symbols, or crudely painted saints rallied people around unspoken causes. These visuals were viral before viral existed. Then came seals, waxes stamped with symbols that authenticated letters and laws. They weren't just functional, they were expressions of identity. A falcon in flight, a tower on a hill, a sword pierced by flame. Each emblem meant something to someone, and through them, ideas passed from one hand to another in secret, in silence. But perhaps the most overlooked communicator of all was the body. Think of coronations with elaborate costumes, jeweled gloves, and processions with banners and relics. Every motion was choreographed theatre, an Instagram reel in real time. And like today's influencers, these rituals built a mythos that was both political and sacred. The message was clear. In the medieval world, symbols were language. They bypassed gatekeepers, reached minds without paper, and cemented loyalty or fear more effectively than any sermon. Power didn't always whisper. It wore its message in gold, stone, and steel. Imagine a time when universities had no libraries, no dormitories, and barely any books. In the medieval world, learning didn't come from shelves, it came from people. Knowledge was nomadic. It travelled on horseback, tucked in its mind, whispered at night by candlelight. And the ones who carried it, the wandering scholars whose classrooms were roads and whose textbooks were memories. These intellectual vagabonds, called clerici vagant, roamed from monastery to monastery, town to town, across the patchwork of feudal Europe. They carried nothing but worn cloaks, a few notes scrawled on parchment, and the most precious cargo of all, ideas. Logic, theology, natural science, the secrets of rhetoric, passed down by voice and mind, not ink and press. Formal universities were rare and centralized in cities like Paris, Bologna, or Oxford. But long before students sat in classrooms, there were informal nodes of learning, local abbeys, cathedral schools, and hidden enclaves where the curious gathered. A travelling master might appear and lecture in a tavern hall, using mnemonic rhymes or symbolic hand gestures to teach logic or debate. His students? A mix of peasants, priests in training, and fellow wanderers. This was the oral web of the Middle Ages. A proto-internet where knowledge flowed person to person. Each scholar was a node and every journey a data transfer. And with the danger of heresy looming, this underground nature wasn't just practical, it was essential. Forbidden texts, such as those of Aristotle or Arabic alchemists, were memorized and paraphrased to avoid detection. Books were expensive, but memory, that was free and untraceable. There were even secret dialects, Latin-based shorthand systems or coded phrases passed among initiates that allowed certain ideas to slip beneath the church's radar. To the untrained ear, it was gibberish, but to the wandering mind, it was enlightening. Then there were the compilatores, compilers who didn't just copy but compressed massive volumes into portable wisdom. These were the first knowledge curators, memorizing entire texts, summarizing them, and transmitting them with oral flair. A 10-pound codex could become a 10-minute tale, wrapped in metaphor and delivered with flair to a hungry audience. Sometimes these scholars travelled with troubadours, performers whose ballads secretly encoded philosophical arguments or scientific ideas. Music became the Trojan horse for theory. You thought you were listening to love songs. In truth, you were learning about ethics, astronomy, or political satire. The church monitored these flows, of course, but even inquisitors couldn't stop every conversation at a roadside inn. In a world without printing, knowledge survived because it was performed. Every lecture, every poem, every whispered heresy was part of a great unrecorded stream, a tradition where truth was carried not by page but by people. So when we imagine the medieval world as silent and ignorant, we forget the noise of these wandering minds. The Middle Ages had their own broadband, it just rode on foot and spoke in verse. Not all knowledge was written or spoken. In fact, some of the most enduring forms of communication in history were never read at all, not in the traditional sense. They were worn, carved, etched into skin or stone, and passed from generation to generation like riddles waiting to be unlocked. This was the silent language of symbols, runes, tattoos, cryptic iconography, a medieval code network without books, parchment, or paper. Let's begin with the runes, the angular symbols etched into standing stones across Scandinavia and the British Isles. To modern eyes, they might look decorative, but to those who knew, runes held entire cosmologies. Some stood for names or family lineages. Others served as magical wards, invoked to protect or curse, but many were used to pass down secret knowledge, navigational paths, ritual dates, even maps of constellations hidden in runic verse. In a world where books were rare and secrecy was power, people relied on symbolism carved into everyday life. A pattern on a sword might indicate its creator's lineage. A spiral on a doorway could mark the solstice. A pair of mirrored animals, perhaps a reminder of duality, or the hidden balance of power in a kingdom torn by war. The Celts, for example, used spiral and knot motifs not just for art, but for mnemonics. These weren't random decorations, they were memory devices, story maps etched into metal, stone, and skin. Each curl and bend could represent a phrase or idea, helping oral poets remember entire epics without writing a word. And what about tattoos? Long before they became decorative, they were instructional. Among some Norse and Central Asian tribes, tattoos were believed to encode genealogies, divine protection, or rites of passage. Some even suggest they were used as biological scrolls, a human archive of sacred scripts designed to be passed down by bloodline, skin to skin. Medieval masons, too, had their codes. If you've ever noticed strange geometric marks on old cathedrals or temples, you've seen their hidden network. Each symbol told other masons who had worked there, what tools were used, or even which arcane geometry governed the structure's design. This was the architecture of secrecy, literally built into the walls. But the most mysterious examples come from lost cultures. Consider the Vinci symbols in southeastern Europe, an undeciphered script predating writing as we know it. Some scholars believe these were early information storage systems, perhaps even religious codes meant only for the initiated. Their resemblance to later religious glyphs in Asia and Europe raises tantalizing questions. Did these proto-scripts evolve into global symbolic languages? Or are they remnants of a communication system we've entirely forgotten? Even churches played along. Medieval cathedrals weren't just places of worship. They were stone encyclopedias. Gargoyles, stained glass, and floor mosaics held moral lessons, biblical warnings, and astrological secrets, all encoded in symbols. The illiterate masses didn't need sermons, they could see the story. From whispering walls to carved bones, the past was filled with languages that didn't need ink. They needed eyes, memory, and the trained mind of the initiated. These non-verbal systems formed a shadow internet of the old world, one that left no books behind, but echoes everywhere. Long before the internet, before mail systems, or even organized trade caravans, there existed a different kind of network. One built not on wires or wheels, but on faith. It stretched from the misty cliffs of Ireland to the sands of the Levant. It crossed deserts, mountains, and seas. It was invisible, yet every step was etched into the memories of those who walked it. This was the pilgrimage network, a spiritual web of trails and shrines that became the medieval world's most efficient form of information exchange. At first glance, pilgrimage may seem like a personal journey, a solitary act of devotion. But it was also one of the most communal acts a person could undertake. Pilgrims were rarely alone. Along the road, they met others from different regions, languages, and social classes. They shared stories, songs, cures, rumors, and myths. News traveled with them, along with recipes, folktales, and even military intelligence. Major routes, like the Camino de Santiago in Spain or the Road to Canterbury, became pipelines of ideas. Locals that would have otherwise remained isolated were suddenly flooded with visitors from all over Europe. These strangers brought not only prayers but knowledge, farming techniques, coinage systems, regional politics, and innovations seen in distant cities. The holy sites themselves served as data centers of the era. A pilgrim might not be able to read, but they could study the murals, carvings, and statuary that adorned these sites. Many churches were deliberately designed as teaching devices, depicting biblical stories in stained glass, labyrinths inlaid into the floor representing spiritual journeys, and altars aligned with astronomical events. At rest stops and shrines, there were monastic hospitals and scriptoria, places where monks recorded not only holy texts, but also what they heard from travelers. These institutions became repositories of collective memory, a kind of analog Wikipedia, curated by scribes in robes. And these routes weren't confined to Christendom. In the Islamic world, the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca created vast exchanges between African, Asian, and Middle Eastern travelers. Muslims traveling across empires brought with them scientific discoveries, poetry, architecture, and legal thought. A merchant from Mali could end up praying next to a scholar from Samarkand, and both would leave the holy city carrying ideas and experiences they would share back home. Even more fascinating were the hidden pilgrimage routes, lesser-known paths travelled in secret by religious minorities or mystical sects. These roads often avoided main cities, relying instead on oral directions, encoded symbols carved into trees or stones, and sacred geometry embedded into landscape lore. They represent a kind of esoteric GPS, now lost to time. Pilgrimage wasn't just about devotion, it was movement, and wherever people move, so does information. The body becomes the carrier, the feet become the pen, the shrine becomes the server. This network, interpersonal, physical, and spiritual, was the medieval internet, and it's still active today, pulsing beneath highways and railways, beneath every souvenir stand along a sacred trail. Before books, before paper was common, before literacy became widespread, memory itself was technology, and those who mastered it, the bards, minstrels, griots, and scops, were the servers of the medieval world. These men and women didn't just entertain, they were preserved, they spread, they archived, they were living libraries, data couriers wrapped in song and verse. A single bard could carry the equivalent of an epic novel in their head, sometimes several. In Celtic lands, druids and filly were trained for decades to memorize vast genealogies, battle chronicles, and wisdom poems. In West Africa, griots passed down centuries of oral history through performance, rhythm, and even coded musical structures. In Scandinavia, skalds recited sagas with internal meters so complex that one wrong syllable would unravel the rhyme entirely. And it wasn't just about memory, it was about movement. These storytellers traveled from court to court, village to village. Each retelling wasn't static, it adapted to the crowd, the politics, the mood. New details could be woven in, making the oral web dynamic. Like a medieval version of a social media feed, their stories were constantly evolving, layered with commentary, satire, and cultural cues. But how did they do it? Without a pen or screen, they used mnemonic architecture. Many employed what we now call the method of loci, a memory palace technique where information is mentally stored in the rooms of an imagined structure. To recall a story, they would mentally walk through their palace, retrieving the lines room by room. A tale could live in a hall with stone pillars, each pillar containing a battle scene, a proverb, a moral turn. And just like modern code, these stories often carried embedded instructions. A tale of a legendary king might include veiled warnings about governance, agricultural tips hidden in metaphors, or tribal laws wrapped in moral dilemmas. The format was the function. Listening wasn't just entertainment, it was education, law, ethics, and survival. Some of these storytellers were highly respected professionals, even feared. In medieval Ireland, a satire from a skilled poet could ruin a nobleman's reputation. In Islamic courts, storytellers wielded influence on par with jurists. In Mongol camps, Epics about Genghis Khan's conquests were recited with ceremonial precision, unifying tribes under a shared mythos. And this oral web wasn't just horizontal. Vertical knowledge, from master to apprentice, was passed in hushed tones with strict ritual. In Tibet, Bonpo monks taught chants and historical narratives via melodic frequencies believed to aid retention. In Ethiopia, Zima chants were sung to preserve not only liturgy but historical chronology, unbroken for centuries. You might imagine this oral world as fragile, but it was surprisingly resilient. Fire could not burn it, ink could not fade it. As long as a memory survived, the knowledge lived. And when one bard passed, another rose to continue the chain. Like peer-to-peer file sharing, it resisted censorship, redundancy, and loss. In a sense, the oral web preceded the written one, and in some cultures, it never died. Even today, oral history projects. Folk singers and tribal elders continue the tradition, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful archives don't sit on shelves, but live and breathe and sing. While kings and conquerors waged wars above ground, something quieter, deeper, and perhaps more lasting was happening below. Beneath the feet of empire, beneath the radar of control, there were places where knowledge was not just preserved but protected. These were the underground libraries, cloistered collections, scriptoria in caves, vaults beneath temples, and hidden script networks that functioned like the encrypted servers of the Middle Ages. Take the Christian monasteries of post-Roman Europe. As Europe fell into fragmentation, these stone outposts of literacy became fortresses of memory. Monks in scriptoria would spend lifetimes copying ancient texts by hand, word by word, line by line, sometimes without understanding what they were transcribing. Aristotle, Cicero, Pliny, Galen, all smuggled into the future by candlelight. But this wasn't just about preserving religious knowledge. Hidden within these monastic walls were texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and even pagan philosophy. Monks sometimes coded them inside religious commentaries, masking them to avoid suspicion from zealous church officials. Others buried books in jars beneath the floorboards, quite literally creating time capsules of forbidden wisdom. In the Islamic world, particularly during times of political upheaval, secret book traders and night copyists operated out of hidden basements and caravanserais. In Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars built personal libraries that rivaled the holdings of small cities, libraries that weren't just static but mobile. Manuscripts were copied on the run, smuggled across borders, hidden in caravans under silk. Even further east in Dunhuang, China, a cave sealed for nearly 1,000 years hid tens of thousands of manuscripts. Buddhist scrolls, medical treatises, maps, star charts, all untouched until their rediscovery in the early 20th century. Who hid them? Why? No one knows for sure. But the very act of hiding knowledge implies a threat of erasure and a profound faith in the future. Not all of these networks were built from stone. Some were human networks, teachers who passed secret writing systems to apprentices by night, often with regional code switching to avoid detection. In medieval Ethiopia, scholars used layered scripts, Ge'ez for the sacred, Amharic for the public, and esoteric glyphs for only the initiated. In Jewish communities across Europe, sacred texts were memorized in secret, copied in attics, buried with the dead when needed, and then there were heretical networks, groups labeled as witches, pagans, or dissenters who preserved pre-Christian or forbidden knowledge. In parts of France and Italy, Cathars maintained oral and written doctrine passed outside official channels. In Eastern Europe, the Bogomils may have encoded anti-establishment philosophies in Gospels altered to resemble orthodox ones, a hidden scripture within a scripture. The sheer redundancy of these networks was genius. One book might exist in a monastery, a synagogue, a mosque, and a heretic's hut, each copied slightly differently, like versions of the same software updated in different environments. If one was burned, others survived. If one scribe died, another was trained. Like the internet's packets, knowledge moved in fragments, resilient and decentralized. Modern archaeologists often find these caches by accident, sealed behind false walls, tucked in burial urns, or woven into fabric linings. What they recover are not just texts, but the passwords of the past waiting for us to log in. Before the printing press, before libraries lined public squares, before newspapers shouted headlines, there were markets. Bustling, noisy, fragrant, chaotic places where goods changed hands and so did stories. In the Middle Ages, the marketplace wasn't just for buying silken spices. It was a neural network pulsing with real-time information, rumours, warnings, and inventions. Merchants were the routers, the market stalls were the forums. Imagine standing in the heart of Constantinople's Grand Bazaar, or a caravanserai in Samarkand. Around you are traders from every corner of the known world: Byzantines, Arabs, Jews, Hindus, Turks, Mongols. Each speaks different tongues, but they all speak information. And they bring more than just bolts of fabric or bundles of incense. They bring stories. A new star has been seen in the sky over Persia. A king in the west has died without an heir. There's a new way to sail using the stars. Each merchant is a moving data node, updating the local matrix with their payload of knowledge. These marketplaces became informal intelligence hubs. Some merchants memorized the news as part of their sales pitch, knowing that novelty was its own form of currency. "Did you hear?" was often followed by, "Then come, look at this." Pilgrims gathered there too, exchanging divine visions or doomsday warnings, prophecies that travelled further and faster than their originators. Guilds and merchant families often curated these flows of information, passing down secrets in tightly controlled channels. A Venetian trader might whisper to his son that a salt route was drying up in North Africa. A Jewish merchant in Cairo might send coded letters along trade paths to alert colleagues of coming taxes. These weren't random anecdotes. They were part of an evolving information economy where trust and networks were everything. The Mediterranean Sea was effectively the data center of the medieval world. Ships brought not just cargo but talk, and so did the Silk Road, with its relay of caravans and inns. At every rest stop, a trader might pause, eat and talk, leaving behind a rumor, picking up another. News traveled like a virus, mutating slightly with each telling, but preserving its essence. This wasn't misinformation, it was oral metadata. And it wasn't just grand events that spread, even scientific ideas slipped through the seams. The concept of zero, for example, passed from India to the Islamic world, and then westward, not only through scholars but through merchant mathematicians who needed better ways to track profit and loss. In many cases, market necessity preceded academic recognition. Women, too, were essential to these networks. In village markets, female vendors often became the keepers of local law, blending product sales with gossip, matchmaking advice, and even herbal recipes passed down orally. Some were literate, some not, but all were nodes in a horizontal chain of data transfer, far more egalitarian than any court archive. To modern eyes, these info exchanges look random, even primitive, but zoom out and they form an organic web of distributed intelligence, resilient, redundant, and borderless. No king could fully control it, no pope could silence it, no war could completely stop it. Even plagues only made the network twitch, perhaps spreading new information even faster. Some merchants even turned this flow into a strategy. Genoese traders carried letters of credit, yes, but also coded news packets, often disguised in religious texts or shipping manifests. These merchant memos helped tip balances in trade disputes or warn of shifting alliances. And when the first banking families rose to power, Medici, Fugger, Bardi, they rose on the back of information carried in wagons and whispers. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often imagine dim candlelit rooms or silent monks in prayer. But the heart of its communication system was louder, faster, and far more democratic. It was the marketplace, and it echoed with news long before Gutenberg's press would give it ink. Long before the first tweet or breaking headline, one of the fastest ways for ideas to travel was through the feet of the faithful. Pilgrimages, those arduous spiritual journeys made to holy sites, were not only acts of devotion, they were acts of information exchange. And in a world without printing presses, every step taken by a pilgrim was a data point added to an invisible web of human connection. From Canterbury to Compostela, Mecca to Mount Kailash, pilgrims carried more than prayers. They carried stories, tales of miracles witnessed, relics uncovered, signs seen in the sky, but also updates from other regions, news of wars, famines, rising kings, and falling empires. These travellers didn't just speak to monks, they spoke to each other, to villagers, to fellow wanderers in crowded inns and on dusty roads. Each conversation was like a medieval podcast, oral episodes full of drama, insight, and speculation. Imagine the roads winding through Europe in the 11th century. There are no official news agencies, no centralized networks. Yet ideas move. Why? Because tens of thousands of pilgrims are on the move each year, some seeking forgiveness, others healing, others sheer adventure. Many are illiterate, but they are never uninformed. They stop at shrines and abbeys, leave tokens, but also take stories with them. And once they return home, they retell them, sometimes as gospel, sometimes as warning. These stories often grew in the telling. A simple healing at a shrine might become a divine resurrection by the time it reached a distant village. A comet in the sky over Jerusalem could be linked to a prophecy in Ireland. Oral culture doesn't just preserve, it evolves, and like a rumour with a purpose, the ideas riding on pilgrim backs were often stickier than anything written in ink. The church understood this. That's why many pilgrimage routes were designed not only for sanctity, but for influence. Abbeys and cathedrals along the way weren't just spiritual pit stops, they were information centres. Priests would deliver news from Rome, monks would copy scrolls and recite tales of saints and sins. In some places, sermons were tailored to recent events, ensuring pilgrims went home as messengers, not just penitents. It wasn't just Christian pilgrims. Islamic hajjis, Hindu tirthayatris, Buddhist travellers, across cultures, sacred journeys created cross-regional connections that carried more than faith. Pilgrims traded amulets and food, yes, but also political gossip, local legends, even medical knowledge. There are recorded instances of herbs and healing practices spreading across continents via sacred travel. For many, the journey became a form of social equalization. A peasant could walk beside a noble, a widow beside a monk. Along the path, they shared food, shelter, and information. The pilgrimage was a horizontal social network in a vertical feudal world, and like any network, it had vulnerabilities. Sometimes false information spread, doomsday prophecies, heretical gospels, or whispers of rebellion. Authorities feared this. That's why some rulers tried to monitor pilgrim routes, posting guards or issuing travel permits. But information is hard to chain when it rides on human breath and hope. The impact of these journeys on medieval minds cannot be overstated. They didn't just reinforce religious belief, they reshaped local worldviews. A man from rural France might return from Santiago with a vision of Spain. A woman from Flanders might bring back tales of relics glowing in Rome. Each new tale, each shared experience layered over time into a shared cultural memory, one that existed without a single printed word. So when we talk about how knowledge spread in the Middle Ages, we can't ignore the quiet power of the pilgrim. They were the feet of faith, yes, but also the legs of a living internet, walking across kingdoms with messages whispered, shouted, sung, and wept. For most of the medieval world, information travelled by word of mouth or handwritten text, but not all communication was meant to be public or even understood. Some ideas were too dangerous, too sacred, or too secret. This is where the secret scripts came in, where communication left the open road and entered the shadowed cloisters and private correspondence of medieval minds. To outsiders, a monk's scribble might look like decorative doodling, but in some cases it wasn't meant to be read by just anyone. Medieval Europe was not unfamiliar with cryptography, codes and ciphers often used to conceal political messages, spiritual knowledge, or scientific discoveries. And long before the printing press, secrecy was a powerful kind of control. One of the earliest known forms of medieval encryption was the Tyronian shorthand, attributed to a Roman scribe named Tiro and adapted in monasteries. This system allowed scribes to write entire thoughts in compact symbols, perfect for swiftly recording sermons or occasionally concealing sensitive insights. Other monks developed their own shorthand or monastic ciphers, systems only decipherable by members of a specific abbey. But it wasn't just about speed or secrecy, it was about exclusivity. To understand these scripts, you had to be trained, often within tight circles. That gave these codes the aura of sacred mystery. Some texts even included deliberate obfuscations, using foreign alphabets like Greek or Hebrew for single words to mask meaning from outsiders. A few inserted anagrams or acrostics, weaving hidden messages into the first letters of lines or chapters. In some cases, the secrecy served faith. Religious orders such as the Cathars used encoded texts to avoid persecution. Others, like alchemists, masked their knowledge in metaphors, symbols, and riddles, not just to prevent theft of ideas, but to protect the uninitiated from knowledge deemed too powerful. Then there were the letters that passed between nobles and clerics, sealed with wax, but also filled with carefully constructed ambiguity, so they could only be fully understood by the intended recipient. We even find examples of cipher wheels, early medieval devices used to create letter shift codes, the kind of substitution ciphers that wouldn't look out of place in World War II spy networks. Some scholars believe certain medieval texts are still unreadable today, not because the language is lost, but because the key to the code has never been found. Manuscripts like the Voynich manuscript, although likely later in date, may be legacies of this obsession with hidden meaning. Who were they written for? And what knowledge did they intend to protect or obscure? Cloisters, too, became intellectual laboratories of hidden knowledge. Monks copied ancient texts, some Greek, some Arabic, and sometimes annotated them with personal notations or encoded commentaries in the margins. These margin notes, or glosses, were not always meant for general readers. They were the medieval equivalent of whispered commentary, passing on interpretations only a few would understand. Meanwhile, outside the monastery, merchant guilds and secret societies, such as early Freemason-like brotherhoods, began to develop their own symbols, rituals, and signs. These acted not only as identifiers, but as veiled communication, a carved mark on a doorway, a ring with a hidden engraving. In a society where your words could lead to death, symbolism was survival. And so, alongside the obvious highways of medieval communication, the town crier, the royal decree, the sermon, there flowed a shadow network, one of ink and implication, of parchment folded tight and eyes that watched the wax seal crack. These were not just messages, they were puzzles, prayers, and protections. In a world of limited literacy, hidden writing may seem like a contradiction, but to those who knew how to read between the lines or across the runes, it was a hidden internet of ideas, a secret web long before we spun the one online. In the quiet scriptoriums and bustling markets of medieval Europe, ideas fluttered like candles in the wind, fragile, fleeting, and too often extinguished. But from beyond Europe's borders came a powerful current of intellectual revival, a wave of rediscovery that would shape the world's understanding for centuries. These were the whispers from the East, insights carried across deserts, mountains, and oceans. Not by printing presses, but by people, scholars, merchants, translators, and pilgrims. In the Islamic Golden Age, stretching from the 8th to the 13th centuries, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba became radiant beacons of knowledge. While much of Western Europe struggled to preserve classical thought, these cities flourished as hubs of translation and synthesis. Ancient Greek texts, long forgotten in the Latin West, were preserved in Arabic and expanded upon with original contributions in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. One of the most important crossroads for this exchange was Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Spain. In cities like Toledo, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked side by side in translation houses, converting Arabic treatises into Latin. The result? A rebirth of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and countless others, reintroduced to Europe not as relics of the past, but as living systems of knowledge. These ideas didn't travel through armies or decrees. They flowed in manuscripts, whispered in oral lectures, and handed down in commentaries that often merged Eastern and Western worldviews. The medieval internet expanded dramatically, not through innovation in Europe, but by rediscovering what the East had preserved and enhanced. Even the concept of paper itself, crucial to the spread of written information, came through Eastern influence. Originating in China, papermaking spread westward via the Islamic world and entered Europe through Sicily and Spain by the 11th century. With paper cheaper than parchment, written communication became accessible to a broader range of people. And it wasn't only Arabic texts. In Asia, Buddhist monastic networks in Tibet, China, and Japan developed complex systems for storing, copying, and transmitting sacred knowledge. Pilgrims brought scrolls across the Silk Road. Travelers returned with texts bound in silk, stories wrapped in metaphor, and maps that redefined the shape of the known world. The Mongol Empire, while often remembered for conquest, also built one of the most interconnected trade networks in human history. Yam couriers, the Mongol relay system, allowed for astonishingly fast communication across Eurasia. This system enabled not just military orders, but cultural exchanges, language, medicine, and even printing techniques using woodblocks. And nestled within these routes were polymaths like Avicenna, Al-Khwarizmi, and Al-Farabi, whose names would eventually echo in the universities of Paris and Oxford, though often stripped of their origins. These weren't fringe thinkers. They laid the foundation for what would become modern science, centuries before Europe's so-called Renaissance. By the 13th century, European students were flocking to universities not just for theology, but for logic, medicine, and astronomy, fields reinvigorated by Eastern knowledge. Manuscripts from the East were copied by hand, passed from scholar to scholar, and became the textbooks of the future. The irony? This intellectual revival, often celebrated as a uniquely European phenomenon, was only made possible because information had travelled across worlds. The internet of the medieval age was not confined to Christendom. It stretched from the mosques of Samarkand to the monasteries of Cluny, from Chinese scriptoria to Italian lecture halls. These whispers from the East, soft, steady, and persistent, would shape not only how Europe understood the world, but how it would one day try to control it. Long before the printing press made knowledge mass-producible, there was a select class of individuals who controlled its very existence, the scribes, cloistered in monasteries, tucked away in imperial courts, or employed by universities and merchant guilds. These were the true gatekeepers of medieval information. Every book, every letter, every official decree passed through their hands, often transformed in the process. The scribe's task was more than mere duplication. In a world where manuscripts took weeks or even months to complete, each copy carried decisions. What to emphasize, what to omit, what to illuminate with gold leaf or illustrate with haunting detail. They shaped not only the text, but the narrative. A single scribe's bias could shift the historical record, and many did. In monasteries across Europe, the work of transcription was considered sacred labor. Pages were often copied by candlelight, in silence, with every letter formed as a kind of prayer. But even among the faithful, errors and alterations crept in, some accidental, others deliberate. A theological term slightly altered, a royal lineage restructured, a heresy silenced with ink. This was power wielded in miniature. The secular world also had its scribes. In royal courts, clerks and secretaries maintained vast ledgers of land claims, treaties, and taxes. These documents became the backbone of law and empire, and those who managed them became political actors in their own right. A forged signature or a miswritten clause could upend dynasties. Meanwhile, in urban centres like Venice, Bruges, and Ghent, merchant scribes created commercial networks of trust. Bills of exchange, shipping manifests, and merchant correspondence created invisible webs of trade that spanned continents. And at the heart of it all, handwritten contracts and ledgers, authenticated not by print, but by handwriting and seals. But scribes weren't always mere tools of power. Some became radical agents of change. In the 14th century, John Wycliffe's followers, the Lollards, hand-copied English translations of the Bible, bypassing church control and laying the groundwork for the Reformation. These underground texts, shared secretly among peasants and reformers, were early viruses in the matrix of medieval orthodoxy. In Jewish communities, soferim, ritual scribes, preserved not just scripture but survival. In Muslim courts, katibs documented law, poetry, and scientific discovery. In Ethiopia and Armenia, Scribal traditions maintained language and history in the face of isolation. The scribe, wherever found, was more than a writer. They were a memory machine for their people. Every copy made by hand introduced variability. Manuscripts diverged over time, forming textual lineages, a kind of genetic drift of knowledge. And so scholars began to compare versions, to sift the truth from the corruptions. This birthed an early form of textual criticism, centuries before Gutenberg would shake the foundations with movable type. In the final century before the press, Europe's scribal ecosystem reached its peak. Universities churned out thousands of manuscripts a year, often in abbreviated Latin for speed. It was the last great flourish of handwritten knowledge, a flowering that would soon be upended by a machine that promised accuracy, speed, and mass distribution. But perhaps something was lost in the transition. The intimacy of ink, the artistry of marginalia, the quiet tension between power and preservation. The scribes weren't perfect, but they were human. And in their cramped script and careful illuminations, they left behind a fingerprint of their time, a medieval internet woven not of wires but of will. As we shut the covers of this journey through vellum and parchment, we're left with a deeper appreciation for something often taken for granted, the very idea of sharing knowledge. Long before fiber optics and smartphones, before the printing press and even the mail, people found ways to connect across time and space. Through ink, through symbols, through memory. The medieval world was never silent. It buzzed with messages carried by monks on horseback, whispered in marketplaces, copied in candlelight. Knowledge flowed not in rivers but in droplets, slow, deliberate, human. And at the heart of it all stood the messengers, the scribes, the travelers, the storytellers, the stewards of the invisible web. Their efforts were imperfect, yes, biased, error-prone, slow, but also rich with meaning. Every margin note, every handmade diagram, every choice of what to write and what to hide tells us not only about information, but about the people who carried it. Their fears, their hopes, their power plays, their hunger for understanding. In many ways, we still live in the echo of that world. Modern algorithms may push data across continents in milliseconds, but the architecture of communication, the yearning to pass on truth, story, and signal, was born in these early networks. The medieval internet wasn't digital, it was human. Fragile, yes, but enduring. So the next time you scroll, download, or stream, remember the monks in their stone scriptoria. The Jewish scribes preserved law. The Muslim khatibs drafted poetry and astronomy. The Lollard rebels hid English Bibles under floorboards. Their legacy lives not just in archives, but in how we think, how we share, how we remember. The internet didn't begin with code. It began with courage, with quill, and with questions whispered into the dark, waiting for an answer. So, after journeying through scriptoria and secret networks, decoding illuminated manuscripts, tracking whispering traders, and uncovering the hidden highways of thought that bound medieval minds together, ask yourself, was the medieval world really disconnected? Or have we just forgotten how connected it was? Before wires, there were words. Before tweets, there were tapestries. And before we uploaded files to the cloud, scribes etched memories into parchment. Couriers risked their lives to carry messages, and ideas leapt across empires with the fire of human will. The so-called Dark Ages were never truly dark. They were lit by the flickering glow of knowledge passed hand to hand, voice to voice, soul to soul. And if that sparks something in you, a curiosity for the buried systems, the unseen networks, and the forgotten genius of ancient minds, then you're exactly the kind of seeker this channel is made for. Hit that like button, not just because it helps the channel, but because it tells the algorithm you care about content that explores the strange and secret corridors of history. Subscribe to uncover more mysteries carved into time, from ancient machines mistaken for idols to prehistoric maps of the afterlife. We go deeper than textbooks, beyond mainstream timelines, and into the liminal zones where myth, fact, and forgotten truth blur together. Leave a comment. What part of this journey surprised you the most? Do you think our modern networks are as resilient or as meaningful as those of the past? I'd love to hear your theories, reactions, or even your own ancestral stories about how knowledge once moved. Share this video with someone who thinks history is boring. Let them see the beating heart behind the dusty dates, and remind them that every tweet and every text is just the latest whisper in an ancient, unbroken chain of communication. In a time where we take instant connection for granted, it's humbling, even inspiring, but to know that humans have always found a way to share, to teach, to wonder, and to reach out to one another, even when the world told them it was impossible. Thank you for watching, for exploring, for questioning. Until next time, keep asking.